Evening, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you tonight. I'm not feeling up to par. And so what I wanted to do was to still hold class because we only have so many classes this semester. But I also wanted to emphasize the importance of the revival tradition within American Methodism. And I think it's something that we as modern Wesleyans, as American Methodists, as United Methodists, need to understand more fully. In fact, I think only certain parts of the country do we see the continued effects of this revivalism as a living reality. But in fact, the entire United Methodist Church was in this country was built upon, I would argue, built upon the revivals of the 19th century. And so I want to look very briefly at Francis Asbury. I'm not going to go into too much detail about Bishop Asbury because you have so much of him in your book. He's just this towering figure, and he should be. In fact, he should be a towering figure because he was probably the most influential American Methodist in the post-Revolutionary War period. Until his death in 1816, Asbury was, for all intents and purposes, the key American Methodist leader. And so to understand Asbury is, in fact, to understand, to a certain extent, the foundations upon which United Methodism is built. Um, the dates for Francis Asbury were 1745 to 1816. If you're thinking about where he might fit in terms of American religious history, think of him being the generation after Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Of course, Jonathan Edwards, known, unfortunately, probably for his sermon "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," was although a Calvinist, was a distinctly key participant within the evangelical revival. It's something that Wesleyans need to remember, is that Calvinists were a part of the evangelical revival. In fact, if I were talking to Calvinists, I'd be telling them to remember that Wesleyans were a part of the evangelical revival. It seems that we've forgotten after we become solidified into denominations. For some reason, we seem to forget that there were a variety of evangelical groups within the larger movement. But after Edwards and after George Whitefield, again, Whitefield, yes, Methodist, Calvinistic Methodist, aren't many of those around anymore, but the Whitefield and Edwards kind of laid the foundation for later American Methodism, because it was people like Edwards and Whitefield who were, well, Edwards was traveling in New England and he really didn't travel that much, but Whitefield was traveling all up and down the colonies, preaching the new birth, preaching the key elements of the evangelical revival. And of course, he was known as a Methodist. At this point, there were a variety of different kinds of Methodists. What marks out Francis Asbury from these two in particular is his distinctly Arminian outlook. This would be the standard line for United Methodism today, an Arminian outlook. And of course, I argue in my book that yes, the term Arminian can be helpful, and Wesley used it himself, but it's more of a Catholic understanding of the role of free will than it is any sort of Reformed understanding of free will. The Arminius himself would seem way too Calvinistic to most Methodists today. And in fact, they would find affinity with the Catholic authors of the Anglican tradition much more than they would with those who claim to be Arminian at some points. But we claim the term now. It means those who believe that they actually have a choice in whether or not they would accept the offer of salvation. That's a key element to American Methodism today. We believe that you have the opportunity, because of God's grace, to then deny God's grace. So it's this interesting combination that's bathed in grace, but still gives the grace-inspired person the ability to say no to God's offer. Now that starts all kinds of interesting theological debates between Reformed and Methodist theologians. So often they hinge on very little, and they accomplish very little, because at the root of both of them is the idea that God does in fact initiate salvation. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. We're not Pelagians. We don't believe that we are somehow lifting ourselves up by our own bootstraps to become saved. We don't actually believe in salvation by our own efforts. We only believe in salvation as it is the gift of a gracious God. But what role do you play in that process or that way of salvation, if we're going to speak like Wesley? So, Francis Asbury was an Arminian. And in fact, you could argue that everyone in the evangelical revival, whether they admitted they were Arminian or not, acted like it because they all went out. They were driven. They were fundamentally driven to share the good news. And you see this over and over again in the journal accounts, in the accounts of the conference meetings and the quarterly meetings and the camp meetings. They're calling people to respond to the gospel. So whether they actually thought that you had the ability to reject God's grace or not, they all acted like you had to hear the message. And so many of them acted like it was really up to them. If they didn't give you the message, then who would? There's something about Methodist history I think we should never forget is the fire that really drove these people. And of course, David Hempton talks about something similar. He talks about the noise of Methodism. It's not the stately mahogany Methodism we have today with pipe organs and stained glass windows. It's the loud cacophony of people wailing in agony over their sins out in a camp meeting situation where they're hearing preacher after preacher and they're singing lustily, as the hymnal tells us. That this loudness and this desire. So both this desire to spread scriptural holiness and to spread the new birth and the noise of it. I think these are things that might be difficult for us as modern Methodists to grasp because we're a much more stately group. But to grasp that and to tap into the energy of early Methodism, I think is something that is, if as a historian I can give you even a taste of that in this class, then I think I've done something to give you an idea of what early American Methodism was like. Think camp meetings, think loud, think boisterous, think emotional. Think of people running around the tent with tambourines even. And you'll have just a glimpse of what these revivalistic movements were like in this new burgeoning American context. Asbury, getting back to Asbury, he was distinguished. Here's for your notes. Here's what you need in your notes. Francis Asbury, distinguished in U.S. history for taking the helm of American Methodism at the end of the Revolutionary War and creating a context, or you could say maneuvering within a context in which Methodism would become the dominant Christian denomination in America in the 19th century. So, Francis Asbury, one of two, Dempster was the other one of the two preachers to stay through the war. Most of them went to Canada or back to Britain. They were loyalists, but Asbury stayed. And Asbury then took the helm of the American Methodist movement, and he led it from near disaster to a place of great influence and revival. That's quite the feat. And of course, he did this pretty much on horseback. Keep that in mind. When you think of the early American Methodist preachers and bishops, don't think of people in offices or in stately towers or in anything else. Think of people getting dirty. Think of people on the road. Think of people in the mud. Think of people sitting on other people's porches and talking to them about Jesus. That was early Methodism. There was this drive, this heartbeat, and this this was not an elite movement. That is something that would only come later. But who was Francis Asbury? Asbury was born in England, but he came to America as one of Wesley's lay preachers in 1771. Wesley actually, at conference, he called for volunteers to go to America, and Asbury volunteered, and he knew at that point. This is the one key point to his story. He knew he wouldn't see his family again, but he took up the charge to come and cross the Atlantic Ocean and bring the story of Methodism, which is simply, remember, evangelical Christianity, over to the New World. He quickly took charge of the Methodist work when he arrived. But with the Revolutionary War, um, as I mentioned, he was one of two that actually stayed. Interestingly enough, he even sided with the colonies, which is something that you'll see over and over again in areas where Asbury differs from Mr. Wesley. And this will be a hallmark of American Methodism. There'll be this deference to Wesley, but they don't actually always agree with him. And Francis Asbury starts off very quickly, once he's an ocean away, to differentiate himself from Father John, or Pope John, as some of these people were starting to call John Wesley. Um, Asbury's willingness to stay with the people and to commit himself to the American cause is what will mark Asbury for the rest of his life. So um, it's a sign that he will run American Methodism differently than Wesley ran Methodism in England. The war, however, had negative repercussions for Anglicans and Methodists in particular. Remember, 1771, Methodists are still good Anglicans. They still think of themselves as Anglicans. And as I've said in class before, when we think of the Church of England and Anglicanism in this period, it's best not to think of a denomination, but to think of the Church of the English. And I think once we get that in our minds, the idea, the apparent squishiness, that's not a technical term, but that's a good term, squishiness of denominational lines makes more sense to us, those who live in an era when denominational lines are very clean and very clear. Um, the Anglicans, as we've talked about, the Anglicans would form the Episcopal Church, and the Methodists would form the Methodist Episcopal Church. And of course, the MEC came first. The Episcopalians organized in the years following, and in 1789 they organized as a formal denomination. They would form with Bishop Bishop Seabury of Connecticut, who was actually a good friend of Charles Wesley, and Bishop White of Virginia, taking leading roles to form the Episcopal Church. Now we have to remember the Episcopal Church on the cusp of the Revolution, or at the end of the Revolution, was absolutely on, if not shaky terms, then they were almost brought to extinction. I don't think we fully appreciate the existential crisis that the Episcopalians would face in this country right after the Revolutionary War. In many places, their buildings, once built by the state, remember, because so many of the states actually made the Anglicanism their state church. Many of their buildings were simply taken over by the people in the area. They thought, well, we paid for these buildings, we'll just take them over and use them for our purposes. It's interesting. There's actually here in Virginia, there is a dry cleaner in Tappahannock that is built. One of the walls is built from the bricks of the old parish church that, after the Revolutionary War, was torn down, and they decided they were going to use the bricks for something else. They didn't create a dry cleaner in the antebellum period. They didn't have dry cleaners, but now that building is a dry cleaner, and you can see the repercussion of what happened to those churches. In the long run, the Episcopalians would suffer most from an inability to keep up with American expansion, although they would solidify themselves along the East Coast, particularly in South Carolina, Virginia, up into Washington, the District of Washington. District of Columbia, Washington, and then up in New York. Later, they would expand into areas in New England. They were strong in Connecticut in the early period. But what's interesting is this early American context is one of expansion. It's not expansion up and down the East Coast and solidifying your old strongholds on the East Coast, which is pretty much what the Episcopalians did. But the Methodists and the Baptists and the Presbyterians, to a lesser extent, were distinctly gifted in keeping up with American expansion. There were often stories of pioneers who reached the furthest areas they thought, where no white person was to be found, where they would only run into Native Americans. And who do they find? They find a Methodist preacher on horseback right there, ready to preach to them. And these are not isolated stories. These are not propaganda stories. These are real. So Asbury, like George Whitefield traveled extensively. And by the time of his death, he recorded 300,000 miles on horseback, which is an enormous number of miles. He crossed the Appalachians, and yes, that's how you pronounce it, 66 times in order to reach those outside the eastern seaboard. Now, there's the politics of all that. The question of whether white expansion should go beyond the Appalachians. Asbury doesn't seem to be too interested in those debates. The question is, where are the people? And if there are people who need to hear the gospel, he'll go to see them. So, but to cross the Appalachians 66 times in this period is just unheard of. Remember, we're not talking about an era with good roads and interstates and all things like that. We're talking about a new country that is just finding its legs in so many ways, including its infrastructure. Much of Asbury's leadership as he wasn't the first bishop, he was really the second because Thomas Coke was first. As really the new principal bishop of this era, let's put it that way, for the Methodist Episcopal Church, his leadership was carried out by example. And that's something to get down in your notes. Asbury's leadership was leadership by example. And I think this is one of his greatest gifts, is the ability to exemplify his vision. He lived a very simple life. He didn't own property. He didn't have a house. He remained single, which was a big part of early American Methodism, was to remain single during the early years of your ministry. But obviously, people do get married. Asbury never got married. You could say he was married to Methodism to a certain extent. He was never going to ask another traveling preacher to do what he himself wouldn't do. And this is just a part of his legacy that he passes down to us even, 200 years later. The idea of leadership by example. Of course, for those of you going into any form of leadership, Asbury is a key person to look at, to how to inspire other people with the vision that God's given you in ministry. All right, so what he did, much like Edwards and Whitefield, was he embraced a pragmatic approach to evangelism within the structures he had inherited from Britain. So that's an interesting combination. We've talked about this a little bit. In this way, he thrived in Adam Smith's new religious marketplace, right? Adam Smith, capitalism, free markets. You've read about this in Hempton. There's this interesting phenomenon that takes place in the 18th century where religion is traded like a commodity. And it's the person or the people or the group that is able to attract the greatest number of adherents by various and sundry means, who in fact win the day in terms of membership rolls. And so what you find with people like Asbury is, yes, he's brought with him and embraces some of the structures inherited from the old world, from Britain, but he also weds it with this amazing pragmatism to reach people with the gospel. What we see in early Methodism that I think is something that I've noted in class already, but I want to note again, is this connection between the old world and its hierarchy, specifically having bishops, melded to the new world pragmatism, the embrace of a new evangelistic efforts and new evangelistic tactics. So keep those in mind as you're looking at American Methodism, because it seems like it would be an impossible connection. How do you have a strict hierarchy, a distinguishable hierarchy, where the bishops are ultimately in control, not only of the content of what's being said, but of where you go? You're told where to go by the bishop. You're still told where to go by the bishop. But in this new world of the American context, the idea of keeping that aspect of the tradition, but kind of jettisoning other things, kind of like liturgy and sacraments, it's an interesting combination, but it's something that really marks the early period. So keep that in mind. The embrace of old world hierarchy together with new world evangelistic tactics. This would continue to be a mark of Methodism in particular, and also of evangelicals in the Episcopal Church. We shouldn't, I know I've mentioned the connection a few times, and it might seem surprising to hear in a class on United Methodism, but I don't want us to forget the close connections between these two churches. And keep in mind Bob Pritchard's theory that I've talked about in class, that in fact there are two forms of Anglicanism that came out of colonial Anglicanism: the Protestant Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church. When you look at it that way, Methodism is going to have affinity with evangelical Anglicans in particular within the Episcopal Church, and so there'll be some overlap in the way they experience the new American context and the way they experience and either thrive in or don't thrive in the context of American expansionism. Asbury's guiding hand. This is important too, because it goes together with the idea of having an authoritative bishop together with a pragmatic approach. His guiding hand over the Methodist connection, and let's be honest, he was not the only bishop. He was not alone, but we should say, for lack of a better term, that he was first among equals. So think back to debates in early church as to the primacy of Rome. Asbury was definitely first among equals when it came to any other bishops in the Methodist Church at the time. But what he did is that he provided a guiding hand somewhat similar to Wesley's hand in the 18th century revival and Jabez Bunting's over the 19th century British Methodist Church, which we had a great presentation on that in class. Within this revivalistic context, a guiding hand, or even, for lack of a better example, someone to hold the lid on a boiling pot was necessary. I think that actually isn't a bad example. Someone to hold the lid on a boiling pot is a good way of looking at how early American Methodist bishops functioned. Their job was to try, I emphasize try, to contain the revivalistic movements and powers that were unleashed by this pragmatic gospel centered on the transforming grace of God. Now, obviously, if you're in leadership in an evangelistic context where, one thing we have to remember about evangelism, keep in mind, we've talked about defining evangelism in class already, but keep in mind that the first and primary definition of evangelical is the experience of the new birth. And so it's a subjective core right from the beginning. And so if you're leading a revival where people are having subjective experiences, and that's the basis upon which everything else is built, then you're going to have different perspectives and different stories and different narratives about that saving event. And so it's not going to be, we've talked about this, but it's not going to be this systematic theological approach that's going to dominate evangelicalism. It's going to be the experience of the Holy Spirit transforming people. So, how do you act as a bishop over that context? Well, that's a difficult one. But Asbury did an amazing job at it, primarily because he was known by the people. That's another key to his leadership. But we do have some dissension. You'll remember the Republican Methodists. We talked about them, the first schism of American Methodism. But for the most part, Asbury's approach to leadership, while authoritarian from our standards, it worked well for the context. Now, the elastic nature of the Methodist conference system, its continuously moving army of preachers, and the expansion made possible by a system that would spread as fast as Western expansion itself, marked the first century of American Methodism. One of the tides that this elastic system was able to ride, we can argue, in the 19th century has been called the Holiness Revival. Or sometimes it's called the Holiness Movement, and it's key to understanding American Methodism. The revivals of the 19th century, especially the Holiness Revivals, were not only a precursor to the Pentecostal revivals of the 20th century, but they were also the heir of the pietist evangelical revivals of the 18th century that shaped American Christianity in fundamental ways, regardless of denomination. So when you're thinking of this, think of waves. Think of populist revivalistic waves. The first wave that we've talked about is the pietistic, wave with Wesley and others. And of course, with any wave, it crests and subsides. So you can think of the pietistic early Wesleyan wave. The next wave would be the holiness movement, and you can throw the Keswickian movement in there. The third wave, and I think we're still involved with that wave now, is the wave of Pentecostalism. But they all have at their root, it seems as though these waves are pushed by the one and the next, so that you end up with these populist, English-speaking for the most part, waves in the 18th, 19th, and then early 20th centuries. To their own credit, the revivalists of this period took full advantage of the rising American fascination with both individualism and the desire for the instantaneous. So, on the cusp of the Revolutionary War, there are shifts, social shifts, political, religious shifts, ideological shifts in the American context. And two of the things that come out of that are things we still see today: individualism and a desire for the instantaneous. Those two elements, I think, were crucial to the success of a movement that promoted personal salvation, right? Think of individualism, and personal sanctification, found in an instant, even at the altar, which became for many American Christians not the place where the sacrament was celebrated or administered, but rather a railing where members of the congregation would find relief and comfort kneeling in prayer. I'm sure many of you have been in churches like that. I grew up in churches like that. If they talked about the altar, they meant that railing. That was right up around the front of the platform. The altar call, which kind of grew out of this, was not to the sacrament, but to a prayer railing. You could call it that. And it was a fundamental shift, I think, not only in terms of architecture, because obviously they had to build these things, but also in terms of liturgy and thus theology. And so what are we talking about? We're talking about the American Methodists, talking about Baptists, Congregationalists, and other evangelical revivalists who were behind the camp meeting and the tent revival meetings led by personalities such as Phoebe Palmer, who was a Methodist, Asa Mahan, who was a Presbyterian, Charles Finney, Presbyterian, Hannah Whitehall Smith, who was a Quaker, Thomas Upham, who was a Congregationalist, and William Boardman, who was a Presbyterian, and then later by Phineas Bresee, who was a Methodist, but who would become the founder of the Church of the Nazarene. The direct denominational heirs of this work would include the Church of the Nazarene, the Free Methodists, the Wesleyans, Church of God Anderson, and a number of holiness groups that are still Wesleyan to this day. All right, the driving force behind this movement was a new Americanized version of John Wesley's doctrine of Christian perfection. I say Americanized because it was essentially shorn of its Aristotelian process, its attachment to sacraments, and place in the workings of early Methodism. When I'm talking about these revivals, the camp meetings primarily came toward the end of Asbury's life. The height of the camp meeting movement was probably, the Civil War obviously caused a hiccup, but you have both before the Civil War, the decades leading up to the Civil War, and then just a few afterwards, you find the camp meeting is still a powerful evangelistic tool, and it grew out of the quarterly meeting, which we'll talk about. The revival, though, I want to note that this revival, this holiness revival, was distinct from the work of original Methodists, Pietists, and evangelical Episcopalians, and it had a message all of its own. I don't want you to think that it was outside of Methodism, though, because while it had a distinctiveness to early Methodism, it really, to a certain extent, was fundamentally a part of American Methodism. But looking at what I'm talking about is really the doctrine of Christian perfection, which we've talked about briefly in class. The doctrine, the idea that the love of God can become the reigning attribute of the heart in this life. Don't forget, the Wesleyan view is that this perfect love, this love reigning the heart and excluding sin, not excluding defect, not excluding ignorance, but excluding willful sin, is something that Wesley expected for the average person in this life. But let's look at the doctrine in particular and how it was revised on this side of the pond, keeping in mind those two things I mentioned earlier, individualism and the desire for the instantaneous. Really, the doctrine of Christian perfection has been a wonderful driving force behind Methodism. Whether one reached it or not, there was always this teleological element to Methodism. You never had reached the goal. You could always continue on in perfection, because obviously we live in a fallen context. You would never live in a place where you couldn't possibly fall again. The doctrine gave Methodists something to shoot for, something that many Christian traditions, especially in the modern period, simply lack. The idea that you get in the door and that you've once saved and you're done. No, that's not Wesleyanism at all. In fact, that's not the richer Christian heritage, which calls us all to Christ-likeness in various ways. But regardless of whether or not one reached perfection, the doctrine gave contour to the Christian journey after the initial stirrings of salvation. There was no need to ask, after having been saved, now what? That was not a question for Methodists. The what was determined. You were to engage in the process of growing in perfect love and hopefully attain something of it on this side of the grave. I want to emphasize that again. I'm concerned when I hear Methodists talk about Christian perfection as though it's something that happens only in death. That is not a Wesleyan view. The Wesleyan view is to believe in the absolute power of God's grace to transform lives even now, even right this moment. That's something that's a part of our heritage, and I think we run from it to our detriment, because what it does is it reminds us that God's grace is more powerful than our sin. The doctrine, however, being a wonderful driving force, has always been controversial, and you can see why. How perfect can we be? How does one attain this perfection? Is there another term we can use other than perfection? We hate this term, perfection. Wesley only used the term perfection because the Bible does, and he was quite the Bible man. But taken out of its liturgical and social structures of English Methodism within the Church of England, that doctrine was adapted in American Methodism in distinct ways. And a divergence arose amongst Methodists and others attracted to the holiness movement over its meaning. So what happens when you take a doctrine that's based on experience and you take it out of its initial context, both liturgical and social, and try to put it in a different context? You should expect that there are going to be some changes. But how did this take place in terms of the Wesleyan doctrine of Christian perfection as it was moved from Methodism within the Church of England to the American context, where Methodism was a church and was no longer understood to be somehow connected to the Church of England? All right, much of this development, I think, was laid by John Fletcher. You've read about John Fletcher in my book and in Heitzenratter's book. He was an Anglican clergyman, and he was a friend of both John and Charles Wesley. Fletcher was the parish priest at Madeley, which is in Shropshire, the birthplace after Fletcher's life, but still the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Fletcher was supposed to be the designated heir of the Wesleys, but he died before John and Charles. His writings, however, have been instrumental in the shaping of both later Methodist and Pentecostal understandings of perfection. Fletcher, in his writings against the Calvinists in the 1770s, began equating Christian perfection with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So that's key to understanding Fletcher. Fletcher equated Christian perfection with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Wesley, it should be noted, did not correct him, although there was a departure from Wesley's Christocentric view of sanctification as becoming more and more like Jesus. That's how Wesley described it, becoming more and more like Jesus. Fletcher obviously described it as being filled with the Holy Spirit. Wesley's view of sanctification, although not devoid of Holy Spirit language entirely, is best understood as a life lived with and in an encounter with Jesus. It's very Christocentric in that regard. That's how he understood sanctification. It was the process of walking hand in hand with Jesus. And I know that sounds like Sunday school, but you know what? Sunday school's right. Walking hand in hand with Jesus is the process by which we become more and more like Jesus. And that was the way Wesley talked about it. Now, Fletcher's understanding of perfection as the repercussion of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, something many Anglicans would have understood to take place at baptism, keep in mind, was to have repercussions in antebellum America. Fast forward to the 1820s and the 1830s. While the Oxford movement, a movement that was seen as a Catholic revival, was gaining steam in parts of the Church of England, another evangelical uprising, or in fact a second evangelical revival, was gaining steam in the U.S. In terms of nuts and bolts, some of this had to do with Methodist expansionism and the ever-present reality of Methodist circuit riders. Keep in mind the circuit riders at all times. You've read about that in Hempton, but one of the repercussions of Methodism's expansion was the quarterly meeting. Some of you may think that no good can come from denominational events meant to organize denominations, but you'd be a little bit off in this case, although oftentimes you'd be right. The quarterly meetings were an essential part of the rise of Methodism in this country, and what they were quarterly gatherings of the Methodists in a larger area for business and for worship. The closing worship gathering of these meetings were often Eucharistic, and the descriptions of the exuberance of these early American Methodist Eucharists are fascinating. We have reports of people at these meetings apparently in anticipation of the service, running around the tents with tambourines yelling, "The king is coming." Or during the service, they'd say, "The king is in the camp." So you can picture these Methodists running around the tents with their tambourines yelling, "The king is in the camp." And of course, what they meant was that the Eucharist had been celebrated. They probably would have called it the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion. And they're yelling, "Jesus is here. Jesus is with us." Now, eventually what happened was that these worship services became the dominant event of the quarterly meetings. And eventually, these worship services pushed the business side of things entirely to the side. And finally, the gatherings became all about worship, and they did business somewhere else entirely. This is where the American camp meeting came into existence. And I know I've talked about camp meetings a little bit even in this video. They were a natural outgrowth of this business meeting where people would come from miles around and they would camp. And they'd hold the business meetings, then they'd hold that Eucharistic service. But now they're coming to camp just to hear the preachers and to hear the revivalistic meetings. Now, camp meeting was a revivalistic event that often ran for many nights or even a few weeks, where tens of thousands of people, would flock to rural areas to hear preacher upon preacher, many of them inspired by Wesley's vision of Christian perfection, combined with, keep in mind this kind of continuing thing here, combined with the American desire for the instantaneous and John Fletcher's spirit-centered understanding of Christian perfection, all coming together in that raucous context. So, You've got this interesting combination. You've got tens of thousands of people coming together to hear preacher after preacher in a revivalistic context for a week or two, and you have preachers inspired by Wesley's call to Christian perfection, but also now using Fletcher's language to describe it within the context, the American context, which is both individualistic and really is driven by this desire for the instantaneous. The preacher, in the height of this wonderful expectancy, would preach that you should be sanctified now, not later, now. In that regard, he was very similar to Wesley, but of expecting that God could act now. But what eventually took place in Methodism, and this was not just a Methodist movement, I want you to know, was an eventual split between those who preferred to talk about sanctification as a progressive enterprise and those who were committed to this instantaneous vision, and those who essentially felt that the whole thing should be left behind as a dinosaur, even as an embarrassment. So you had those kind of three groups. What I want to help you understand, though, is the difference between the revivalistic, Fletcher-inspired understanding of sanctification and Wesley's isn't the instantaneous part. It's what goes before it and what goes after it. Because both elements contain the instantaneous. Why? Because it's God's work. One is sanctified at some point. And it's not something we do. It's not something we earn. And so keeping together the progressive and the instantaneous like that reminds us that it's God's work. Now, but the progressive element with Wesley's understanding was such that he expected somebody to be going from grace upon grace and taking part in the means of grace and participating in the classes and bands and societies and taking communion and participating in the liturgy. We've talked about this in class about how Wesley created with his structure an economy of grace. And so, but you take that economy of grace, which is not a quick, immediate type of thing, even if it does contain that element that says God can sanctify you and does sanctify you in a moment. What this Fletcher-inspired American revivalism did was it got rid of the economy. And so sanctification was a second movement of the Spirit that often took place instantaneously when one felt called to go to the altar. And I still remember, I grew up in this tradition where you would go up and you'd sing "I Surrender All" about 30 times. And the expectation was that you, by offering your life to God, then He would sanctify it. And it's not a bad model. I'm not saying it's a bad model, but what I'm saying is it's different from Wesley's model. And what it did is it took Wesley out of his liturgical and ecclesiastical context, added the Fletcher element of being filled with the Spirit as the equivalent of sanctification, and then put it in the context where people wanted things immediately. And it was very individualistic, so it didn't happen necessarily within that economy of grace. I hope this is all making sense. Now, where this kind of Fletcher-inspired view took place, or took root, today you would find that amongst Nazarenes, Free Methodists. Although I should say there's a lot of conversation among Nazarene theologians right now about returning to a more classically Wesleyan view. But also, this is key to United Methodism, is that this kind of revivalistic viewpoint of sanctification remained strong amongst United Methodists, or American Methodists, I should say, in the American South. And so you'll find within United Methodism today a very strong evangelical presence within the South, in particular because the revivalists who and they didn't necessarily have to believe in this instantaneous Fletcher-inspired sanctification, but the revivalists never left Methodism in the American South like they would in places in the West and in the North. Now, you have a general outline of this movement. It's very general, although you've got some of it in your book, and I think Hempton does talk about it a bit, but you have most of it in the Ritchie book. But keep in mind that this had great variation in the U.S. and eventually in the U.K., where we have the Keswickian movement. was started as a holiness revival, but more with a reformed bent to it. In other words, not claiming outright perfection in this life. In the U.S., we see not only the three variations I mentioned in Methodism, but we see congregational and Baptist versions of this holiness interest. The ecumenical aspect of this revival should not be ignored, although I'm focusing more on the Wesleyan side of things for obvious reasons. I do want to look at a moment at Phoebe Palmer, who's really a fascinating person in church history, and I even highlight her in my church history survey class. But 1807 to 1874, Phoebe Palmer, 1807 to 1874. I especially want to highlight some of her methods used to promote holiness, because she's going to take the Fletcher-inspired idea of perfection to a whole new level. She was one of the most influential persons in the entire movement. And it should be noted that she accomplished this as a woman in the mid-19th century and as a layperson. She was not ordained. So a lay woman in the mid-19th century, I would argue, was one of the greatest influences in American Methodism. Palmer was the wife of a wealthy physician in New York City. His name was Walter Palmer. And her Tuesday meetings for the promotion of holiness, you've read about these, a meeting that I've mentioned before in class, it became an important center of holiness teaching and a place where the who's who of the period often were to be found. It's interesting to juxtapose Palmer's New York parlor and the rustic nature of the camp meeting, because they were both in the same movement. And she, it should be noted, was to be found in both settings. Palmer was vital to a new role for women's ministry, whether ordained or lay, and opened the door for women's voices like few had before. One of the reasons for this was her insistence that those who had experienced what she termed entire sanctification, or the second blessing, had to testify to that experience. And thus it enabled both men and women to speak in the church and to testify, that's the word Wesley used, right, for preaching, to do that in public. Women were called to testify along with men in the revival meetings themselves. And this public voice was given another outlet in the social movements that sprang from this drive toward godliness or holiness. Both the abolitionist movement, especially in New England, and the temperance movement, which we heard about last week, can be traced to this emphasis on holiness. Palmer's understanding of holiness is based in large part on her experience of the loss of three of her children. It's a sad narrative. This led to her equating holiness as a gift given by God instantaneously when we would give everything over to God. Palmer, however, even after she claimed this experience of spirit indwelling, was cautious to promote it in front of men until she was able to help a prominent congregational minister. Yeah, I know. Sorry, this is going to totally distract you. This is Paisley. I'll start that sentence over again. Palmer claimed this experience of spirit indwelling, but she was cautious to promote it in front of men until she was able to help a prominent congregational minister, Thomas Upham, I named him earlier, experience the same thing. And much of her ministry was a ministry of speaking. And she would speak along with her husband, but primarily Phoebe, not Walter, at meetings in the U.S., Canada, and in the U.K. She published numerous books and articles, including her most famous book, which is called The Way of Holiness. This freedom of expression for women also found its way in abolitionism, as I mentioned. A friend of mine recently did a doctoral dissertation on the repercussions of the doctrine of entire sanctification on abolitionism in New England in the 1830s up to the 1860s. His thesis is this, that the Civil War, as a horrible bloodbath, frightened New England Methodists away from the doctrine, having seen the effects of this radical call to freedom from sin. So what he's saying is, when people believe that you could be free from sin, and they attached it to the idea of being free, like as in a free person, um, they stopped preaching freedom from sin because they saw what happened when they actually took the doctrine to its logical conclusion. And so there's an interesting debate as to why some Methodists stopped preaching holiness, and that's one idea, that after the bloodbath of the Civil War, they were afraid to, in fact, continue to preach such a radical notion. Now, like any other theological term, it's important to look at synonyms in order to understand what people were really talking about. The synonyms that Wesley used to describe Christian perfection, often using the word love, were exchanged for words and phrases to describe a movement, such as the American use of the term second blessing. I do want to highlight two groups that came out of this revival and ended up leaving Methodism, because I think it's important for us to. We're not leaving Methodism. They left mainstream Methodism. They're still Methodists. It's important for us as United Methodists to understand our connection not only to Episcopalians, but also to the Free Methodists and the Nazarenes. First, the Free Methodists. Understand the word free. The Free Methodists, they broke away in 1860. They broke away for a number of reasons. There were three in particular, though. Free pews was one of them. In order for churches to raise money, they actually would sell the rights to pews, to seats. And so you'd have your family pew. But the problem is, what if you couldn't afford it? Well, you had to sit in the back. And so there was economic stratification within the body of the church itself. And so they reacted to that. And they didn't have any, there were no pew rentals and no pew charges. Two, freedom in terms of abolitionism. They were abolitionists, and they believed that mainstream Methodism had not maintained that strong abolitionist heritage that it had received from Wesley. And so they fought for abolitionism. The other free was freedom from sin. They were a holiness movement, and they felt that mainstream Methodism had not maintained its emphasis on Christian perfection. And in some ways they were right. There were aspects of Wesley's doctrine that many didn't like, and there were those who reacted in certain ways against the revival, and didn't like the I guess you could say they didn't like the idea of Methodism being associated with camp meetings and other things like that. This is the rise of a more elite form of Methodism. And so they left behind them what they thought were some of the more extreme doctrines. But the Free Methodists, yes, hi Paisley. The Free Methodists were such that they couldn't they were in the upper part of New York State, in the burned out zone is what it's called, the burned over zone. And this was a place where all kinds of interesting religious movements sprang up, including Joseph Smith and the Mormons. And so they call it, that's the burned over district, actually, is the term. But the Free Methodists would start there in upstate New York with a man named Orange Scott. And there were some other people involved. But what I want you to get from this is the Free Methodists are a part of the American Methodist tradition that continue to remind mainstream Methodism of some of its original intentions. Second group I want you to get down as we wrap up this presentation, is the Church of the Nazarene. And they grew out of the holiness movement toward the end of the 19th century. The holiness movement, under Phineas F. Brzee, who actually, he was a Methodist district superintendent in Southern California. He believed in the message of holiness and an instantaneous perfection in the Fletcher style. And he struggled. There were some in Methodism who didn't think he should be still in the denomination. So he ended up leaving, interestingly enough, not because of holiness, but because he wanted to work with the poor, and the structures of the church weren't capable of allowing him to do so. So instead of just going where he was appointed, he then just went and worked with the poor of Los Angeles. That didn't actually, the people he had decided to work with, he didn't actually get along with them either. So there might have been a pattern here. But what Brzee would do is in 1895, he would form the Pentecostal Church of the Nazarene. Later, in 1908, the Pentecostal Church of the Nazarene would merge with other holiness groups from the Midwest and the South, and they would form ultimately the Church of the Nazarene. They would drop the word Pentecostal because it would take on new meaning after the Azusa Street revivals. But the Nazarenes would embody the same sort of emphasis on holiness, especially in line with Phoebe Palmer's vision, and they would continue as the strongest, the largest holiness denomination in this country. And to this day, they remain so. The Nazarenes, I think, are definitely worth looking into as United Methodists because we can understand better the 19th century emphasis. It's interesting, they did drop some of the structures of Methodism while Free Methodism maintained them. Now, in all of this, this is quite the sweep, the lecture that kind of, swept over about 100 years' time. What I want you to get out of this is not only key personalities like Asbury, like Fletcher, like Palmer, like Brzee, but I'd also like for you to understand and keep in mind when you're looking at the history of American Methodism, the absolutely fundamental role that was played by Revivalism in shaping American Methodism into what it is today.